I knew something was wrong the moment I spotted the pink streamers flapping in the wind on my pasture fence. Now, I don't mean to sound dramatic, but when a woman like Cheryl Whitmore, president of the Ridgemont Hollow HOA, starts decorating property she doesn't own, something's about to go sideways. Real sideways. I'm Franklin Corley. I live on the edge of the neighborhood where my 5-acre lot butts up against the open fields. It's the only parcel in Ridgemont Hollow zoned for livestock, and I use it. I raise 3 bulls, real, horned, 1,000-pound bulls, not the cartoon kind. And the only thing keeping them from wandering into suburbia is a tall, reinforced steel fence I installed the day I moved in. Cheryl's always hated it. Claimed it ruined the aesthetic harmony of the community. Which is HOA speak for it doesn't look like her Pinterest board. She's tried to find me, cite me, even had the HOA attorney send a cease and desist letter which my lawyer, bless her soul, laughed at over coffee. But this was new. I walked out in my boots, still muddy from the morning feeding, and came face to face with a nightmare. Cheryl had dismantled the eastern section of my fence. Not just the decorations, the fence. A full 20 feet of it gone. In its place, a pergola with balloons and folding chairs. A handmade sign read, Ridgemont Hollow Spring Social hosted by Cheryl. I stopped dead in my tracks. My bulls were supposed to be on the other side of the pasture, but bulls are curious animals, curious and territorial. Cheryl, I shouted. What the hell did you do to my fence? She turned in her pastel sun hat like she was on a yacht, not my property. Oh, Franklin, don't be so dramatic. I had it temporarily removed for the event. It was such an eyesore, and this space is perfect for the party. You can put it back up tomorrow. You had it removed. That fence contains 3 bulls. You understand that, right? She rolled her eyes. You always exaggerate. I've lived here 15 years and never seen a bull. Because they've been contained, Cheryl. Just then, like a cue from the universe, I heard it. The low, guttural snort of Big Joe, my largest bull. I turned, and sure enough, all 3 of them were trotting toward the breach in the fence, drawn by the noise, the colors, and the smell of finger foods. Oh my God, Cheryl whispered, suddenly pale. Yeah, I said. You might want to cancel those party games. Big Joe didn't charge, not yet anyway. But he picked up his pace, and the other 2 followed close behind, their broad heads swinging low as they crossed the open stretch of grass, now devoid of any barrier. The guests, mostly HOA loyalists in pastel polos and sun hats, stood around with paper plates, drinks in hand, frozen in place like lawn ornaments. One of them dropped a plastic cup, and the sharp pop it made on the patio stones was enough to set Big Joe into a full gallop. Cheryl let out a strangled noise, something between a gasp and a scream, and backed straight into a folding table stacked with deviled eggs and lemonade. The table tipped, and she stumbled sideways, catching herself on a balloon arch that deflated with a long, slow hiss. Everyone inside. Now, I shouted as I jogged past her. Move, slowly. Don't run unless you want to get flattened. People scattered in every direction, grabbing purses, phones, and in one case, an entire tray of cookies. A man in khakis nearly tripped over a garden hose as he sprinted toward the Whitmore house. The bulls thundered across the lawn, knocking over chairs and trampling decorations as they zeroed in on the scent of food and motion. I whistled sharply, cutting through the chaos, and Big Joe hesitated just enough for me to step in front of him. I raised my arms, palms out, and squared my shoulders. Joe, I said firmly. Back. He exhaled hard, nostrils flaring, then stopped. The other 2 slowed too, milling behind him, their hooves tearing shallow divots in the turf. I took a slow step forward, then another, guiding them with the same voice I used every morning. They followed, reluctantly but obedient. I led them in a wide arc, back toward the paddock, herding them with nothing more than my presence and the familiarity of my stance. It took 5 solid minutes, but eventually I got all 3 back inside the pasture. I used my truck to block the gap in the fence and parked it at an angle to keep the bulls from wandering again. When I turned around, Cheryl was standing on her front steps, hands trembling, a smear of egg salad on her blouse. Her guests were huddled inside or peeking from behind curtains. "You could have killed somebody," I said, walking up the driveway. "You tore down livestock containment without permission or understanding of the risk. That's criminal negligence." She opened her mouth, probably to say something about aesthetics or temporary use, but I cut her off. "Save it." "I'm calling the sheriff." Her eyes widened as her husband, Dale, appeared behind her. He looked like a man who just realized his retirement party had turned into a court deposition. I called it in. Sheriff Mendoza arrived 20 minutes later along with Deputy Grigsby. They knew me. I'd filed permits for every structure on my property, passed every inspection, and never once had a violation. Mendoza walked the site with me, eyeing the torn-up turf, the broken fencing, and the half-crushed folding chairs. "She had the fence removed," he asked. "Not just removed, hired contractors to dismantle it, without my knowledge or consent. That's trespassing, destruction of private property, and endangerment. Those aren't just animals, they're livestock." Dangerous when provoked. Grigsby took photos while Mendoza talked to the contractors, who were still sitting in their truck looking pale. They hadn't even unloaded their tools. "They said she told them it was her property," Mendoza said. "Gave them a signed work order." "I've got the property lines recorded with the county," I said. "And I've got dated photos from last week showing the fence intact, same fence that's been there since I moved in." "What about the bulls?" "Registered, tagged, fully permitted." "I can give you the paperwork," he nodded. "You're going to want to file a formal statement. This one's going to go up the chain." Cheryl tried to insert herself into the conversation then, all flustered apologies and excuses. "I didn't know," she said quickly. "I thought that portion was communal land." "It's always been such an eyesore, and I had no idea there were actual bulls." "Ma'am," Mendoza interrupted. "We've got 3 witnesses who say they heard you instruct the workers to remove the fence because you didn't like how it looked. That's not a misunderstanding." "That's intent." Dale stepped forward, trying to smooth things over. "Isn't there some kind of warning system, maybe a fine? We're all neighbors here." "Not when someone's nearly trampled to death," I said. "She endangered lives because she wanted a prettier view for her party." "That's not neighborly. That's reckless." Mendoza had the contractors pulled aside to get their statements. Meanwhile, Grigsby reviewed my security footage, which I pulled from the mounted cameras facing the pasture. It showed Cheryl walking the workers through the removal process, pointing and nodding as they began dismantling the fence section by section. Not a hint of hesitation. "Looks like you've got enough here to press charges," Mendoza said. "I intend to." By evening, Cheryl had been served with a police summons. Word traveled fast. By the next morning, the neighborhood group chat had exploded. Screenshots found their way to me, courtesy of a few sympathetic neighbors who'd quietly disagreed with Cheryl's rule happy reign for years. Turns out, this wasn't her first overstep, just the biggest. One neighbor, a retired city planner named Irene, discovered that Cheryl had been misrepresenting lot boundaries for months, using a manipulated copy of the original HOA layout to claim more control over surrounding properties. She'd even tried to designate a community garden on land that legally belonged to a couple down the block, who'd filed a quiet title action last year and won. Another neighbor, Mike from the cul-de-sac, revealed he'd been fined 3 times for unauthorized shutters that matched the exact design approved in the HOA handbook. He'd filed an appeal, but Cheryl had lost the paperwork. It was all unraveling. The HOA board, clearly rattled, called for an emergency meeting. For the first time in years, residents packed the clubhouse. The usual empty chairs were filled with people holding printed documents, highlighted sections of bylaws, and a growing sense of shared fury. Cheryl walked in like she still ran the place until Mendoza showed up mid-meeting with a court order for her to cease any administrative functions pending investigation. She was escorted out. In her place, Irene stepped forward and presented a petition signed by over 2/3 of the homeowners requesting a vote to dissolve the current board and hold new elections. The motion passed unanimously. As for me, I spent the next few days replacing my fence, reinforcing it with heavier gauge steel just for good measure. The bulls were fine, if a little annoyed by all the commotion. I gave them extra feed and let them roam the upper pasture for a while. Cheryl's case moved forward. She was charged with misdemeanor trespass, destruction of private property, and a civil suit from me that, according to my attorney, looked very promising. She hasn't been seen much since. Her house went up for sale 2 weeks later. The listing didn't mention the view of the pasture. The Sunday after Cheryl's forced exit, I was stacking corner posts near the north end of the pasture when a black SUV rolled up and parked across the gravel shoulder. 2 men stepped out, both in plain clothes, but one wore a badge clipped to his belt. They approached with that calm, deliberate pace that meant they weren't here to chat. "Mr. Corley?" the taller one asked. "That's me," I said, setting down the post and wiping my hands on my jeans. "Detective Sandoval. This is Investigator Leung with the County DA's office. We're following up on the Ridgemont Hollow incident. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" I nodded. "Sure, I've got nothing to hide." They didn't waste time. Leung flipped open a folder with aerial photos and documents I hadn't seen before. "We've been looking into the HOA's property filings over the last 5 years. You're aware your lot was included in their most recent annual report as shared green space?" My stomach turned. "No, I wasn't," I said. "That's private land. It's been zoned agricultural since the 70s. I pulled the records myself when I bought it." Sandoval nodded. "That's what we thought. But someone's been submitting altered plats to the county assessor's office. Your fence line marked and recorded years ago was digitally edited out in the copies filed by the HOA. The submission came from Cheryl Whitmore's office." I crossed my arms. "You saying she tried to change the parcel map to claim my pasture as community property?" "Exactly that," Leung said. "And not just yours. 3 other boundary adjustments were submitted in the last 2 years. The other homeowners caught it early, but yours passed through unnoticed, likely because of the rural designation." That explained how she felt bold enough to dismantle the fence. She didn't just think she was entitled to the land, she tried to rewrite the law to make it true. "Is this part of a bigger case?" I asked. Sandoval glanced down the field. "We're building a criminal fraud case. Forging land records is a felony. If we can tie it to any financial gain, say, HOA dues charged for use of that land, it opens the door for wire fraud and racketeering." That was a word I didn't expect to hear. Racketeering. "You'll need to testify," Leung added. "Not just about the fence or the bulls. Everything, the meetings, the fines, the letters, we need a pattern of abuse." "You've got it," I said. "She's been manipulating the rules for years." After they left, I called Irene and filled her in. She told me she'd already been contacted. So had Mike from the cul-de-sac and the couple who'd won their quiet title suit. We were all connecting now, the once isolated victims of her overreach, forming a picture that was getting uglier by the day. That week, the temporary board held a town hall to update the neighborhood. It was standing room only. Irene stood at the front with a copy of the HOA's financial records, which she'd obtained through a transparency clause buried in the bylaws. What she found had everyone leaning forward in their chairs. "Over the past 3 years," she said, "the HOA has spent over $60,000 on landscape beautification projects on land that doesn't belong to the association, including Franklin's pasture." She held up a receipt for a deposit made to a design firm, same one that supplied the pergola Cheryl installed during her party. Then she pulled up a slide showing wire transfers to a consulting entity registered under the name CW Property Solutions, LLC. "CW as in Cheryl Whitmore," someone muttered. "Exactly," Irene said. She was funneling HOA funds into her own shell company, billing for consulting fees related to land development. A murmur spread across the room, followed by stunned silence. She was prepping for a buyout, Irene added. There's an email chain showing she was courting a developer. Promised them she could deliver 3 lots worth of common land for a boutique housing extension. That land was Franklin's and 2 other private parcels. The room erupted. People stood, shouting questions, demanding to know how no one had caught it, but Irene didn't flinch. She used her authority to suppress complaints, she said. Fines, delay tactics, selective enforcement. And she doctored the maps to get around the county's zoning restrictions. What's going to happen to her? Someone asked. She's being investigated, Irene said. The DA's office is involved. That's why we've hired an outside forensic accountant. We're cooperating fully. The meeting ended with a vote to suspend all current HOA fees pending legal review. For the first time in years, people walked out of the clubhouse not just angry but united. Later that night, I got a knock on the door. It was Dale, Cheryl's husband. He looked worn down, shirt wrinkled, eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in days. I need to talk to you, he said. It's about Cheryl. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. I didn't know, he started. About the maps, the money, none of it. She kept everything locked behind her office password. I thought she was just fastidious. I didn't say anything. He wasn't looking for reassurance. She got desperate, he said. She thought if she could deliver that land to the developer, they'd cut her in on the profits. They were calling it Whitmore Heights in the proposal draft. I raised an eyebrow. She named the expansion after herself, he winced. Yeah, the plan was to resign from the board once she brokered the deal. Use the payout to fund a move to Charleston. And she thought no one would notice. She figured you'd settle if it came to it. Couple of threats, maybe a quiet payout. Said you were stubborn but not suicidal. I stepped closer. She removed a livestock fence. That could have killed someone. I know, he said. She's not sleeping. She's convinced she's going to prison. She might. He hesitated. I'm cooperating with the investigation. I already gave the investigators her laptop and all the HOA financials I could access. If there's anything else you need, testimony, documents, I'll help. I nodded. You should talk to the DA's office directly. They'll know what to do with it. He left quietly. I watched his SUV disappear down the street, then went inside and sat at the kitchen table, mentally sorting through everything I'd just learned. The next 2 weeks were a blur. Cheryl was officially charged with 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of forgery, and 1 count of criminal misrepresentation of public documents. The county filed a motion to freeze her assets, including the proceeds from CW Property Solutions. Her house sale was halted pending the outcome of the investigation. The developer she'd been courting issued a statement denying any formal agreement, but the emails told a different story. Cheryl had promised access to land she had no legal claim to and had already accepted an under-the-table deposit. Meanwhile, the HOA received court approval to restructure under a temporary administrator appointed by the county. Irene was named acting president, her first order of business. Publicly releasing all financial records and initiating a full audit. The new board held its first official election a month later. I didn't run for anything, but they gave me a front row seat. People had started calling me the bull guy in a tone that carried more respect than mockery now. At the end of the meeting, Irene came over and handed me a folder. What's this? I asked. Your formal exemption, she said. Unanimous vote, the fencing stays, the bulls stay. And nobody touches your land again without a court order. For the first time in months, I felt the weight slide off my shoulders. Appreciate it, I said. You earned it, she replied. You didn't just stand your ground. You held the line for the rest of us too. As I walked back to my truck, I looked out over the pasture. Big Joe was grazing near the far end, calm and content. The new fence gleamed in the afternoon sun, solid and unbroken, and for the first time in a long while, Ridgemont Hollow felt like home. The first morning under the new HOA board, I found a letter taped to my gate, not a fine, not a citation, just a handwritten note from a neighbor named Illy who lived 3 houses down. It said, "If you ever need help with the pasture or repairs, I've got tools and time. You kept us from getting steamrolled." I folded it and slid it into my glove box, not out of sentiment but because it meant something had shifted. People were watching out for each other again. The pasture was holding up fine. The new fencing had deeper foundations and heavier fasteners. I'd even added a coded gate lock just to keep wandering hands from testing their luck. The bulls had calmed. They moved like they knew the edge of their world was safe again, but the neighborhood wasn't done unraveling. 2 days after the audit started, Irene rang my doorbell holding a manila folder and an expression that meant something was about to get worse before it got better. "They found something," she said. "Something big." "You got a minute?" We sat at the kitchen island while she spread out copies of vendor contracts, email printouts, and 3 notarized letters from former HOA board members who'd all stepped down in the past 2 years. Each one said nearly the same thing. Cheryl had pressured them to sign off on budget reallocations they never saw finalized. One even described being locked out of the HOA email system after questioning an invoice. Irene tapped a particular document. This one's from last summer. A landscaping invoice for $25,000, paid to a company that doesn't exist according to the IRS. "Fake vendor?" I asked. "Worse. The business address traces back to a P.O. box in another county. The account it was paid into belongs to Cheryl's niece." I leaned back. "So she was embezzling through family fronts." "Exactly, and that's just the money trail. There's more." She flipped to a screenshot of a chat log, time-stamped from a board group account. The language was careful but unmistakable. It detailed a plan to suppress a vote, to install surveillance cameras at community entrances. Cheryl had argued it was a privacy violation, but the logs revealed another motive. She didn't want anyone recording construction vehicles coming in and out while she was staging the land for that developer. Irene slid over one last photo, a drone shot taken by a neighbor's teenage son. It showed a gravel path carved behind the eastern tree line, leading from a side road directly to the edge of my pasture, hidden from the main street. That path wasn't on any official HOA maps. It had no permits, but it was wide enough for delivery trucks. "She was prepping the site for equipment," I said, "before she even got approval." Irene nodded. "Without the board knowing, without the city knowing, and definitely without you." I stood. "You called the DA, they're already investigating, but they want more than financials now. They're opening a criminal conspiracy case." I didn't ask how they got there so fast. I knew the answer. The moment you tie tampering with legal documents to stolen funds and unlicensed land use, it stops being a zoning issue and becomes something prosecutors can sink their teeth into. Especially when public safety was involved. By the following week, subpoenas were issued. Cheryl's niece was brought in for questioning, and her emails revealed another layer kickbacks. She hadn't just been funneling money. She'd offered small payouts to neighbors on the board to stay quiet. 2 had accepted. One had used it to pay off a car loan, the other to cover a lien from a failed business. Irene called an emergency meeting. This one was held at the local community center instead of the clubhouse, partly because of the crowd, partly because the new board didn't want to use anything Cheryl had touched. I stood in the back while Irene spoke from the podium. "We have evidence," she said, "that former board members accepted illegal compensation in exchange for silence. We also have proof of document forgery, unlicensed land use, and coordinated financial theft." Gasps filled the room. Not just from disbelief, some were from recognition. Cheryl had built a web and people were realizing just how deep they were in. The county attorney took the mic next. Tall woman, calm voice, all business. "We've filed charges," she said. 3 counts of felony fraud, 2 of conspiracy to commit forgery, and 1 of reckless endangerment tied to the livestock incident. "Miss Whitmore is currently in custody." That part hit the room like a cannon. Dale wasn't present. Word was he'd moved out a week earlier, renting a short-term place out of town. Probably to put distance between himself and the fallout, the attorney continued. We are also pursuing civil penalties against the former board members who accepted payments. If you were involved and wish to cooperate, now is your window. 3 people stood up and walked to the front, all of them former board members. No one jeered or shouted. The silence in the room carried its own weight. After the meeting, as people filed out, a man I hadn't met before approached me. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a name tag that read Victor Lot 12. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I used to think you were just being stubborn, about the fence, the bulls, all of it. Turns out you were the only one paying attention." I didn't shake his hand, but I nodded. That was enough. The next month was cleanup, legal, physical, and emotional. The county sent in inspectors to review every HOA-controlled structure. Turns out, 2 of the retaining walls had been built without proper drainage, and a new garden shed near the tennis courts lacked a foundation altogether. Irene coordinated volunteers to rebuild what they could and apply for grants for the rest. As for the pasture, I made a decision I hadn't considered before. I offered to host a community tour, not a party, not a social, but an open walk through where families could see the bulls, learn how they were handled, and understand why that fence mattered so much. I didn't decorate. I didn't cater. I just opened the gate and stood nearby as kids gawked and parents asked questions. One boy asked if Big Joe had a favorite food. I told him he liked molasses cubes, and the kid's eyes lit up like I'd handed him treasure. By the end of the day, more than 40 people had walked through. Some left notes, others just nodded on the way out. But the message was clear. Trust had started growing again. The charges against Cheryl moved to trial. She pled guilty to avoid a longer sentence. She took a deal: 5 years probation, full restitution, and a permanent ban from holding any position in a community association. She sold her house under court supervision. The proceeds went directly to the HOA's restitution fund. The board changed too. Elections were now open, ballots anonymous, and every financial record posted publicly every quarter. Irene stayed on as president for 1 more term, then stepped aside to let a rotating council take her place. No more lifetime authority, no more hidden meetings. As for me, I kept to my routine. Morning feedings, fence checks, slow evenings on the porch. But neighbors waved more often now. Some stopped to chat. A few even brought over homemade bread or offered to help haul feed during the rainy weeks. The fence never had to be defended again. Not with bolts, not with lawyers. It stood because now everyone knew why it had to.